All right, let's get right into it with a question that honestly sounds like something from a movie. Could one single notarized contract signed in a small German town have legally sold the entire world? We're about to unpack a story that is, to put it mildly, absolutely wild. But let me ask you this first. Have you ever, maybe just for fun, thought about starting your own country? You draw the borders, write the laws, maybe even design a cool flag. It's a fun little daydream, right? Well, for some people, it is way, way more than that.
Because people actually go out and do this. They're called micronations. You've got Sealand, which is literally a World War II sea fort out in the North Sea. There's Liberland, on a tiny piece of land that Croatia and Serbia can't agree on. And you even have Christiana, a self-proclaimed free town smack in the middle of Copenhagen. So yeah, for some people, the dream is very, very real.
Okay, but what does it actually take to go from a cool idea to a real, legit country? As you can probably guess, there's a rule book for this stuff, and it's buried deep in the world of international law. And the go-to definition, the classic one, comes from the Montevideo Convention of 1933. And it's actually pretty simple. It says you need 4 things: a population that sticks around, a clearly defined piece of land, some form of government, and the ability to actually deal with other countries. Seems straightforward enough, right?
Well, not so fast. Because here's the big catch. Even if you nail all 4 of those points, you're still missing the most critical piece of the puzzle: recognition. If other countries don't acknowledge you exist, then in the eyes of the world, your nation is basically a ghost. You can have your flag, you can have your government, but you're not getting a seat at the UN. Politics, it turns out, always gets the final say.
So creating a brand new country is tough. But what happens when existing land, existing sovereignty changes hands? Well, international law has a term for that too. It's called state succession, and it's all about the rules for how power gets legally transferred. And this usually happens in one of 2 ways. First, you've got dismemberment. That's when a whole country just shatters into new pieces, like the Soviet Union did. The original state is just gone. Then you have secession. That's when a part breaks off to do its own thing, but the original mother state is still around, like when South Sudan separated from Sudan. Now remember these 2 ideas because they are absolutely crucial for what's coming next. And that brings us to a former NATO military base in a German town called Zweibrücken. This is where our whole story really kicks into gear, with a bizarre local saga that would eventually be known as the Kingdom of Kreuzberg. The story itself starts out pretty normal. The Kreuzberg Kaserne was a NATO base used by Dutch soldiers. Then, on October 6, 1998, the German government sells it. Simple enough. But pretty soon, fights break out over things like utility bills and who has access to what, and it all ends up in court. And then, in August 2002, things take a wild turn. The buyer declares the property is now the sovereign kingdom of Kreuzberg. The whole saga officially ends, at least on paper, when the place gets foreclosed and auctioned off in 2003. And you can imagine the local reaction. It was just confusion and frustration. The mayor of Zweibrücken at the time said it was all just absurd things that bring the whole city into disrepute. It was a messy local drama. But beneath all that local noise, a much, much bigger claim was taking shape. And that brings us to the document at the very center of all this, Notarial Deed number 1400/98. So the big question is, was this just a regular old property contract, or was it, as some people claim, the single most important legal document in modern history? You have these 2 totally different ways of looking at this one document. On one hand, it's a simple real estate deal. A former military base gets sold. Happens all the time. On the other hand, it's a world succession deed, a treaty that hands over sovereignty of the entire planet to one person. So, how on earth do you get from a simple property sale to that? Okay, here is the absolute core of the argument. Proponents say Deed 1400/98 isn't just a private real estate contract. They argue it's what's called a Völkerrechtlicher Vertrag, an international treaty. Why? Because the sale was explicitly tied to the NATO Status of Forces Agreement. This, they claim, makes the contract a Nachtragsurkunde, a supplementary deed,
which then legally latches onto the entire chain of treaties, all the way up to the UN. They even claim it was ratified by Germany's parliament, turning it from a simple sale into an act of international law.
And this is where their domino effect theory really kicks in. So follow me here. Step 1. The deed sells the base as a whole unit, infrastructure and all. Step 2. This infrastructure includes things like gas, power, and, critically, telecommunication networks that don't just stop at the gate. Step 3. Those networks, of course, connect to the national grids, and then the global grids, including the telecom networks overseen by the ITU, a UN agency. And here's the final incredible leap. Step 4. By buying those networks as a single legal unit, the buyer didn't just buy a base. They legally acquired sovereignty over everything those networks touch. In other words, the entire world.
So how do they justify this massive claim? The theory hinges on a legal concept called concludentus handelen, or implicit acceptance. The logic is, since every country on Earth uses the global telecom network, a network that was part of the sale, their continued use of that network is a form of silent legal agreement. In international law, if you fulfill even part of a treaty, you're bound by the whole thing. And since the buyer was a person, not a corporation, they argue he can hold sovereign rights, just like the kings of old. So, by this logic, he inherits all of NATO's rights, including the power to define borders, giving him jurisdiction over every nation on the planet.
And here's the kicker. The move they claim makes this whole thing permanent. They point to a 2-year statute of limitations in international law, and since no country on Earth officially objected to this treaty, within 2 years, well, according to the theory, the deal was done, the whole world was sold, and the sale is now irreversible. The conclusion they draw from all this is just breathtaking. In their own words, classic international law has come to an end. It is not replaced by a vacuum, but by a new world law. A completely new global order with a new ultimate authority, all springing from that one document.
So what we're left with is this tale of two completely separate, conflicting realities. In one corner, you have a secret legal coup that reshaped the entire planet. And in the other, well, something a lot less dramatic.
If you buy into the theory, then the world as we know it, with all its independent countries, is basically an illusion. A new sovereign legally took over back in 1998, and that entity now holds final, undeniable authority over every person and every piece of land on Earth. But then, you have the documented, reported reality. On July 9th, 2003, that very same property, the supposed seat of a new world empire, was foreclosed on by a local German court. It was sold at auction for 200,000 euros. To pay off debts.
So what do we make of all this? Is it the story of a hidden legal masterstroke that quietly reordered the globe? Is it a journey down a deep ideological rabbit hole that started with a simple property dispute? Or is it maybe a far more complex story about how belief, law, and reality can smash into each other in the most unbelievable ways? That ultimately is for you to decide. Thanks for joining The Explainer.